The first time Karen knocked on my door, it wasn't to introduce herself. It was to complain. I had just finished installing a backup generator beside my garage when she marched up my driveway with the kind of determined walk that usually means someone is already angry before the conversation starts. She didn't say hello. She pointed directly at the generator. "That's not approved," she said. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked over at it. The generator sat on a small concrete pad behind the side fence, mostly hidden from the street. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, and it was installed by a licensed electrician. More importantly, it was necessary. Approved by who? I asked. The HOA, she replied immediately. Of course. Karen had moved into the neighborhood about 6 months earlier and somehow became the unofficial enforcer of every rule the HOA had ever written. Mailbox, paint slightly faded? Karen noticed. Grass half an inch too tall? Karen noticed. Someone parked their car in the driveway overnight? Karen noticed. Now she had noticed my generator. It's a permanent power system, she continued, pulling out a folded paper from a clipboard. All exterior installations require architectural approval. I glanced at the paper. Sure enough, it was an HOA notice template. But what Karen didn't know, because she hadn't asked, was why the generator was there in the first place. My electrician handled the permits, I said calmly. That's not the same thing, she replied. I'm pretty sure it is. Her eyes narrowed. I'll be reporting this to the board. Okay. She stood there for a moment, clearly expecting an argument. When she didn't get one, she turned and walked back down the driveway. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 days later, an official letter arrived from the HOA. Violation notice. Unauthorized equipment installation. The generator had not been approved by the architectural committee. If I wanted to keep it, I needed to submit a formal application and pay a review fee. Otherwise, the notice warned, the HOA could pursue corrective action, which was vague enough to mean almost anything. Normally, I would have filled out the paperwork and moved on. But there was a problem with that. Because the generator wasn't just a convenience. It was connected to a dedicated backup circuit inside the house. One that powered exactly 2 things. My son's medical equipment and the oxygen support system beside his bed. 3 months earlier, my son Lucas had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that caused his breathing to stop during severe episodes. Most days he was fine. But when the episodes hit, the life support equipment kept his airway open until the attack passed. Doctors had made one thing very clear. The equipment could never lose power. Not even for a few minutes. The hospital had strongly recommended a backup generator for exactly that reason. So that's what I installed. The generator automatically switched on if the power failed. No delays. No risk. Just a quiet system sitting outside the house, doing the one job it needed to do. And now Karen wanted it removed because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. I stared at the violation letter sitting on the kitchen table, then looked down the hallway toward Lucas's room. The faint hum of his monitoring equipment echoed softly through the house. The idea of disconnecting that backup system wasn't even a discussion. But apparently the HOA thought they had authority over it. And Karen, more than anyone, seemed determined to prove it. What she didn't realize was that corrective action could go a lot further than sending letters. And 3 weeks later, she was going to take that authority much further than she ever should have. For the next week, I ignored the HOA letter. Not out of defiance. Just because I had bigger things to worry about. Lucas had a follow-up appointment with his specialist, and those trips were exhausting for him. The hospital was nearly an hour away, and the testing alone could take half the day. The generator sat quietly beside the garage the entire time, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Nothing. Backup systems are like that. They only matter when something goes wrong. Still, the HOA clearly hadn't forgotten about it. 5 days after the first notice, another envelope showed up in the mailbox. This one had second notice, compliance required, stamped across the top. According to the letter, I now had 7 days to either remove the generator or submit a full architectural application for review. Failure to comply could result in fines or further enforcement measures. The wording was intentionally vague again, but the tone was sharper. And the signature at the bottom? Karen's. She wasn't just reporting violations anymore. She was apparently on the architectural review committee. That explained a lot. I set the letter down and rubbed my eyes. Part of me wanted to march straight to the HOA office and explain everything about Lucas's condition. But another part of me didn't like the idea of having to justify my son's medical needs to a group of people arguing about property aesthetics. It shouldn't have been necessary. The generator was legal. It was professionally installed. And it wasn't bothering anyone. Still, Karen clearly thought she had leverage. 3 days later, she proved it. I was in the backyard checking the fuel level on the generator when she walked over from the sidewalk again. Clipboard in hand. Same tight smile. "Have you removed it yet?" she asked.
No.
"You're past the second notice." "I'm aware." She glanced at the generator. "That equipment isn't approved under community guidelines. It's medical backup equipment." She blinked. "What?" "For my son," I said. "He's on life support monitoring. The generator keeps the system running if the power goes out." For the first time since I'd met her, Karen hesitated. Her confident posture shifted slightly. "Well, that's unfortunate," she said after a moment. "Unfortunate. Like we were talking about a broken lawn sprinkler. But the rules still apply," she added quickly. I stared at her. "You're serious?" "The HOA cannot make exceptions without formal review. Even for medical equipment?" "That's not my decision," she said. "It's the board's." "And the board knows about this?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she scribbled something on the clipboard. "You still need to submit the application." Then she turned and walked away again. I stood there beside the generator for a long time after she left. The low afternoon sun reflected off the metal casing. Quiet. Unobtrusive. Just sitting there in case something went wrong. Later that night, Lucas had one of his episodes. It wasn't the worst one we'd seen, but it was bad enough that the monitor alarms woke me up from the couch. His breathing slowed. The oxygen support system kicked in. The machine hummed steadily beside his bed. Within a few minutes, the episode passed. Lucas drifted back to sleep. I sat there in the dim light of the room listening to the equipment run and thinking about Karen's words. The rules still apply. Apparently, the HOA believed that included deciding whether my son's life support backup power was architecturally acceptable. What I didn't know yet was that Karen had already started escalating the situation behind the scenes. Because 2 days later, the HOA decided to take corrective action, and they chose the worst possible way to do it. 2 days later, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just another neighborhood outage. Storms rolled through our area pretty often, and the electrical grid wasn't exactly perfect. When the lights flickered that evening, I barely reacted. But then something strange happened. The generator didn't start. Normally, the system would kick on automatically within 5 seconds of a power loss. I tested it multiple times with the electrician when it was installed. 5 seconds passed. 10. Nothing. That's when I heard Lucas's monitor alarm from down the hallway. A sharp, repeating beep that instantly made my stomach drop. I ran to his room. The backup battery inside the medical system had already switched on, but that battery was only meant to last 15 minutes. After that, everything depended on the generator. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. The neighborhood streetlights were still on. That's when I realized something was very wrong. This wasn't a power outage. Just my house was dark. I reached the generator and checked the control panel. The automatic switch had been flipped to manual shutoff. Someone had physically disabled it. My chest tightened. No electrician would have done that. No utility worker would have touched a private generator. Which meant one thing. Someone from the HOA had come onto my property. I ran back inside and switched the generator on manually. The engine roared to life after a few seconds, and the house lights flickered back on. Down the hallway, Lucas's equipment stabilized. The alarm stopped. His breathing returned to normal. I stood there for a moment just listening to the machines hum again. Then the anger hit. Not the kind of anger you get over a parking ticket or a noisy neighbor. The kind that comes when someone risks your child's life over something petty. I walked back outside and looked toward the side of the house. That's when I noticed the small plastic tag hanging from the power meter. A bright orange notice. HOA Compliance Enforcement, Equipment disabled.
My hands clenched into fists.
They hadn't just complained about the generator. They had actually shut it off, which meant someone from the HOA had entered my property while I was gone. Someone who thought they had the authority to disable equipment connected to a home where a child was on life support. There was only one person in the neighborhood who would have pushed something like that.
Karen.
I didn't even bother calling the HOA office. Instead, I grabbed the orange notice, my phone, and the generator control panel cover that had clearly been opened. Then I drove straight to the police station. Because HOA rules might let someone argue about paint colors or lawn height. But trespassing onto private property and disabling life support backup equipment? That wasn't an HOA issue anymore. That was a criminal one. And Karen was about to find out just how serious that mistake was. The police officer at the front desk didn't interrupt me while I explained what happened. He just listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally writing something down. When I finished, I placed the orange HOA tag and the photo of the generator switch on the counter. That switch was physically turned off, I said. My son's medical system runs on that generator if power fails. The officer leaned back in his chair, and someone from the HOA admitted disabling it. They left that notice, I replied. He studied the tag carefully. Then he looked up. Sir, disabling equipment connected to life support systems is extremely serious. I know. Do you have documentation about your son's condition? I pulled out the folder I'd brought from the hospital. Doctor's letters. Medical device specifications. The emergency generator recommendation. Everything. He read through a few pages. Then his expression changed. Not angry, just focused. All right, he said finally. I'm going to need the HOA office address. I gave it to him. 2 officers arrived at the Pine Ridge HOA office less than an hour later. I wasn't there when the conversation happened, but I heard about it later from one of the other board members. Apparently, Karen had been very confident when the officers walked in. She assumed it was about a complaint, another resident dispute, maybe a noise issue. But when the officers asked who had authorized the generator shutdown, the room went quiet. Because suddenly the HOA board realized something important. They had no authority to touch equipment on someone else's property.
None.
Not legally. Not under any HOA rule. Karen tried to explain. She claimed the generator violated architectural guidelines. She claimed the HOA had enforcement rights. But the officer stopped her halfway through the explanation. Did you enter the homeowner's property to disable equipment? He asked. Karen hesitated. Well, yes. And were you aware the generator powers medical equipment for a child inside the home? That's when the room reportedly went silent. Because no one had told the board. Karen had never mentioned it. The officer closed his notebook. Ma'am, he said calmly, that action could be considered criminal trespassing and reckless endangerment. Karen's face apparently went pale. One of the other board members immediately started asking questions. What equipment? Medical system? What's going on? Within minutes, the situation inside the HOA office completely collapsed. Board members who had supported Karen's enforcement push suddenly realized how dangerous the situation had become. The HOA president reportedly turned to her and said something along the lines of, "You shut off power to a medical system?" Karen tried to explain again, but by then it didn't matter. The officers issued a formal incident report, and they strongly advised the HOA to reverse all enforcement actions immediately. By the time I got home that evening, there was already an email waiting in my inbox. Subject line: Urgent. HOA violation withdrawal. The message was short. The generator violation had been canceled. All notices were withdrawn. The board apologized for the misunderstanding. Karen's name was nowhere in the message. But the apology didn't stop there. Because the next day something else happened that Karen definitely hadn't expected. The HOA called a special emergency meeting, and the agenda had only one item on it: her actions. The emergency HOA meeting happened 2 nights later. Normally, those meetings are quiet, half-empty events where a few board members argue about landscaping budgets and mailbox colors. This one was different. By the time I arrived at the community clubhouse, the parking lot was full. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood. People knew something serious had happened. Most of them didn't know the details yet, but the police visit to the HOA office had definitely gotten attention. Inside, the room was already crowded. Residents sat along the walls and filled the rows of folding chairs. Karen was sitting at the board table, near the front. For once, she didn't have a clipboard. She didn't even look up when I walked in. The HOA president called the meeting to order a few minutes later. His voice sounded tense. Tonight's meeting concerns a compliance enforcement incident involving a homeowner's backup generator. A few people murmured. The president continued. It has come to the board's attention that a member of the architectural committee entered private property and disabled equipment connected to a home medical support system. That's when the room went completely silent. Someone in the back whispered, "Medical support." The president nodded. Yes. He didn't say Lucas's name, and I appreciated that. But everyone in the room understood the seriousness immediately. He turned toward Karen. "Did you disable the generator at Mr. Harris's property?" Karen shifted in her chair. "I was enforcing the architectural rules. That wasn't the question." She hesitated. "Yes." The reaction from the room was immediate. Several people started talking at once. One woman gasped. Another resident shook his head in disbelief. The HOA president raised his hand for quiet. Entering private property without permission and disabling electrical equipment is not part of HOA enforcement authority. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but another board member cut her off. "And you failed to inform the board that the equipment powered medical devices." Karen looked down at the table. "I didn't know." That wasn't entirely true. I had told her, but I didn't say anything. The board member leaned back in his chair. "Well, the police report says otherwise." That line ended the discussion. After a few minutes of private conversation among the board members, the HOA president addressed the room again. Effective immediately, Karen Mitchell is being removed from the Architectural Compliance Committee. More whispers spread through the crowd. But the president wasn't finished. Additionally, the board will be issuing a written apology to Mr. Harris and his family for the incident. I nodded once. That was enough for me. The generator stayed exactly where it was. The HOA never mentioned it again. And Karen? She stopped attending meetings entirely after that night. A few months later, a moving truck showed up outside her house. By the end of the week, she was gone. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Lucas's condition stabilized with treatment, and the generator continued doing what it was always meant to do, quietly waiting in case the power ever failed. Most people in the neighborhood barely noticed it anymore. But every now and then, when I walked past it on the side of the house, I'd remember the day someone thought HOA rules gave them the authority to shut it off. Turns out, some rules matter a lot more than HOA guidelines, especially when someone's life depends on them.